Hi everyone, I am Gabriel and this is the Hour of the Raven, your channel for everything Ravenloft, RPG, Dungeons and Dragons and horror. Today we will explore the history of Ravenloft as a campaign setting for the Dungeons and Dragons through its many editions. Hour of the Raven. Ravenloft. What does this word mean anyway? Ravenloft is the name of the castle ruled by the vampire Count Strahd von Zarovich, which in turn is the name of one of the most famous RPG adventures officially launched by Dungeons and Dragons, that inspired a campaign setting with the same name. Confused? Yeah, well, let's get this straight. Ravenloft is an official Dungeons & Dragons adventure originally launched in 1983 when Tracy and Laura Hickman, the famous writers who helped to create the Dragonlance setting, wrote an horror adventure. The adventure, which was already in development for some time, intended to modify the way the players interact with classic monsters such as a vampire. The idea was to build an adventure with a vampire that was really unique and scary, a great, dangerous and memorable villain, and not just another regular monster, a pile of stats that would be easily dispatched by the player. The adventure was launched as the I6 module, under the name of Ravenloft, and became a great success. The product described the heroes having to face the infamous Count Strahd von Zarovich, an old and powerful vampire count inspired by the famous Count Dracula, and to enter in his castle on the top of the mountain peaks over the village of Barovia, called Castle Ravenloft. In this adventure, the heroes were engulfed by a strange mist from any other campaign, kingdom or adventure in which they were previously, and emerged in the distant lands of Barovia, a landscape inspired by the medieval Transylvania, and ruled by the cruel Count Strahd von Zarovich. Fleeing from these lands eternally surrounded by the mist was impossible, and the adventurers were compelled to confront the dreaded vampire in his castle. With the tragic past of Count Strahd and the interior of the castle richly detailed, the adventure still countered with a random element to define certain goals and important item locations, which were determined in a card reading by the mysterious Madame Eva, the leader of the Vistani, an adaptation of the Romanian people to the RPG, sometimes mistakenly called gypsies. More important than all this, the adventure encouraged the game master to invoke a horror mood, describing the scenes in detail and creating a constant atmosphere of tension. The game master will be encouraged, for instance, to not simply tell the players that they enter a catacomb and find a room full of zombies, but to describe the scent that invades the nostrils of the adventurers, while rotting bodies suddenly emerge from a torture room partially submerged in stagnant water, with empty eye sockets filled with worms on their faces. Count Strahd von Zarovich himself is a fearsome adversary. The adventure suggested various fighting strategies, traps, tricks of the feared vampire and arcane, which made his actions unique and always leaving the heroes in a tense mood as they explored his infamous castle. The adventure was one of the best-selling adventures of all time and is often listed as one of the best official adventures of Dungeons and Dragons until these days. Taking advantage of the success of the horror theme adventure, another module was released in 1986, called The House of the Griffin Hill. A direct sequel to Ravenloft, the module I-10 brought back elements that made success in the first adventure, such as random goal settings, item locations, and adventure mysteries, and took the heroes to another setting, the lands of Mordant. This time, the plot involved an alchemist conducting experiments in the haunted house of the Griffin Hill, and a complex plot that marked the return of the fearsome vampire Count Strahd von Zarovich. Although endowed with a much more complex and confusing plot than its predecessor, the adventure was well received and contributed to the idea of creating a campaign scenario exclusively focused on Gothic horror. Until then, these adventures had been drinking directly from the source of the vampire tales, especially from Bram Stoker's Dracula book. The success of these adventures motivated the TSR to embrace the idea and to launch new adventure scenarios adapting other themes of Gothic horror into the Dungeons & Dragons RPG. It was then that a campaign setting for these adventures came to be, named also as Ravenloft, the Realms of Terror, where the idea of a demiplane of dread was developed, a dimension that shelters several kingdoms and characters directly taken from other concepts and themes of horror. In 1990, the Ravenloft campaign scenario, known informally as the Black Box, was then launched. The campaign setting helped to set the tone for the adventures, consolidating the Gothic elements that define not only the great villains and dark lords, creatures tormented and doomed by their tragic deeds, but also the heroes themselves, survivors and adventurers in a dark, tragic and mysterious world where evil is prevalent. The product also helped the game masters themselves to establish the dark and more adult themes of this scenario by exploring horror narrative techniques and incorporating classic elements of the genre into the setting. With the scenario launched, the Ravenloft campaign setting started to receive several specific products. We were then in the great and long golden era of Dungeons & Dragons, which at the time was in its second edition, called Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, the most prolific period in terms of product development and publishing. Not long after its publishing, the campaign scenario already counted with several supplements, books of optional rules, adventures, novels, and even some electronic games. The scenario was revised in 1994, just 4 years after the launch of the original campaign scenario, in a box set known as the Red Box. The material released in this new edition brought together various elements that had been introduced into separate supplements, and imported new rules that brought even more ambiance to the horror scenario. These rules included the game mechanics for the power tests, where heroes who committed evil deeds could attract the attention of the dark powers and be slowly corrupted until they became monsters themselves. Also, the mechanics for game tests of fear, horror, and madness that tested the adventurers' resolve and sanity when they faced the horrific reality of that world, and the rules for the powerful curses that could be roused against or by the characters in extreme situations. The lands of the campaign setting had also undergone significant changes in the geography in order to give it a more coherent landscape. Some domains were excluded or relocated from the central core lands by incompatible geographical and climatic criteria, while others were removed to islands surrounded by the mists because its horror concepts worked best in isolation. These modifications were justified within the game by a great event called the Great Conjunction, which involved a series of 6 official adventures that completed the signs of an ancient prophecy. Still in the golden age of the second editions of Dungeons & Dragons, the scenario gained yet another update in the book Domains of Dread in 1997. Although it did not have the charm and accessories of the old box sets, the book compensated in content, bringing a further update on the history of the Realms of Terror and compiling the rules of the setting with a lot of information on the domains and dark lords. The golden age of Dungeons & Dragons, however, was coming to an end, and the time had come for an anticipated evolution and modernization of the rules system. The game was once again called only Dungeons & Dragons, and underwent significant change to its rules. Ravenloft Campaign Setting underwent even more drastic changes. The Wizards of the Coast acquired the rights to Dungeons & Dragons of the bankrupt TSR and decided to focus their future publishing in the popular Forgotten Realms setting. The Ravenloft Campaign Setting was then licensed in 2000 to White Wolf, the company responsible for the excellent Storyteller and World of Darkness RPGs, and was published through this company. Besides the necessary adaptation of the rules and scenarios of Ravenloft to the new system of the 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons, the campaign setting was still updated in his history. Some copyright issues, however, made some iconic characters vanish from the campaign setting, such as the Death Knight Lord Soth, originally from the Dragonlance world, and the Dark Lords Vecna and Cass, originally from the Greyhawk world. Despite these setbacks, the scenario was well developed by White Wolf, who delved into detail in the various domains and Dark Lords, giving even more consistency to the Ravenloft scenario as a unique and vivid place with a story of its own, not just a location for where to send your players in an isolated Halloween adventure. Ravenloft's publishing and licensing rights returned to Wizards of the Coast in 2005, in the end of the 3rd edition, and they decided to relaunch once again the Ravenloft's original adventure, this time with the name Expedition to Castle Ravenloft, putting once more the adventurers to face the dangerous Count Strahd von Zarovich. In 2007, with the launch of the controversial 4th edition of the Dungeons & Dragons rule system, the expectation was that the Ravenloft campaign setting would receive a new update. The Wizards of the Coast even announced the relaunch of the Ravenloft campaign setting as a future project, but the product was cancelled for reasons still unknown. In spite of this, during the 4th edition era, the Wizards of the Coast launched a board game of Castle Ravenloft, and even published 3 Ravenloft novels, although none of the novels happened in a domain previously known to the public, and none of the books updated the history of the Realms of Terror. There was also a change in the cosmology of Dungeons & Dragons, and the demi-plane of dread and dark powers were officially inserted in the Shadowfell, a kind of dark mirror plane of our reality, permeated by shadows and death. With the arrival of the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, we expected that the Ravenloft campaign setting would again be released and updated by the Wizards of the Coast. The launch of Curse of Strahd campaign was a bittersweet news. The beautiful supplement brings back the original Ravenloft adventure, with some minor upgrades and modernizations. In addition, the books create an entire campaign to be played inside Barovia, which is richly detailed with new locations and beautiful maps. The negative side, however, is that although the demi-plane of dread is mentioned in the book, the setting is totally ignored by the supplement, which treats Barovia as a land surrounded by the mists, without contact with the outside world, as in the original adventure. In addition, the change of background of some characters and events implied that there will be no continuity of the history of the campaign setting that was being previously developed. If a new world of Ravenloft will emerge from the adventure Curse of Strahd, it would undergo a major change and even incongruities with the previous history of the setting. If we will still see more of Ravenloft in 5th edition, we do not know. If we take into account that the adventure Curse of Strahd has been well received by critics and public, we can keep some hope in that direction. Despite this, there is no indication yet that the Wizards of the Coast is planning to launch other classic Dungeons & Dragons settings, other than the default Forgotten Realms scenario. Only time will tell, however, whether this corpse can be revived or whether we will only see it as a ghost. Without any new publication on the campaign setting since the end of the 3rd edition, those who wish to venture in the mysterious lands of the mists must dwell on the ancient relics and forgotten tomes of the 2nd and 3rd editions of Dungeons & Dragons. If this is your intention, join us in this dark journey and subscribe to this channel, and together we will delve into the mysteries of these lands surrounded by mists and their tormented inhabitants and dark lords.